So, welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with founders and leaders on some of today's top marketplaces. So, this is episode 71, which is a really great group chat that we just had with Brennan Spellacy, who's the CEO of Patch. So, Patch is building a platform for negative emissions, which allows businesses to leverage the API for calculating emissions and making transactions climate positive. They just announced their $20 million Series A from top funds like Andreessen Horowitz and Version 1 Ventures. So this is a really great group chat with Brennan where we dove into the problem that Patch is solving for, got to learn more about their API first approach as a marketplace, the recent funding round, and also had a great Q&A for those that were on the chat. So I really enjoyed this conversation, and I know you're going to find it a great watch to the end. So Brennan, welcome to the group chat. It's definitely great to have you join us here today. Also, a big congrats on your recent Series A announcement. And, I've been following along with you and your journey building Patch for some time now. So I'm really excited to learn more about it on the group chat today. Before we jump into things, though, I think it'd be great if you could start off with sharing a little bit more on your background for those that don't know you.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. So as far as my background, I originally grew up in New York on the East Coast. Studied chemical engineering at McGill with the intention of working in renewable energy or low carbon energy systems. So that's kind of the initial hint of why Patch would eventually become a climate business or climate adjacent. And then that ended up not working out. I only got jobs in oil and gas in Canada. And so I decided to become a programmer instead. So I became a programmer at Shopify right after their Series C. It was about 350 people. And then I would join a small hospitality startup called Flatbook, which is then known as Sonder. I joined Flatbook when it was about 15 people and helped scale that business from 15 to around 1,500 people at its peak and back in March, April 2020. And it was there I met my co-founder, Aaron Grunfeld. And essentially it was there we kind of came up with the idea of Patch and then ended up starting Patch in April, May of 2020. So kind of right when things locked down with COVID-19 is when we decided to start the business. And that was really kind of the first, kind of to bring it back to the marketplace focus specifically, the beginning to understand marketplace dynamics was actually at Sonder. Because although Sonder is not a marketplace, we were a supplier to many marketplaces, primarily online travel agencies or OTAs. So that was Airbnb, Booking.com, HomeAway, TripAdvisor, things like this. So there was actually a surprising number of parallels between most marketplace businesses. And so actually a lot of that experience lent itself really well to starting Patch.
Yeah, that's quite the experience. And I know many of us here know Sonder. So, maybe what are some kind of learnings from your time at Sonder that you then took with you to Patch?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I'll give one like high level learning, and then I'll maybe anchor it specifically to marketplaces specifically, because I know that's kind of what this group is interested in. So first and foremost, like any business or startup involving atoms and just like moving stuff or people, is like, I would probably say like an order or two magnitudes more difficult than like a pure software business. Like it is like trying to unplug 100 concurrent toilets in like a city in Sonder was like a very difficult problem, and incredibly arduous, honestly. And I joke all the time with the folks at Patch that being a founder of Patch is actually way easier than being an early employee at Sonder, just because of how difficult and onerous it was versus like running what some may consider a more pure software business. As it pertains to marketplaces, it's really interesting. The biggest thing that we learned there was how much influence suppliers of marketplaces have over the marketplaces themselves, if you truly have something that could be considered a quartered resource. So when we were there, most of the kind of inventory, if you will, on Booking.com or Expedia were traditional hotels. That's not what Sonder was. Sonder was, some people called it an apartment hotel, some people called it a multifamily unit. It was really, spaces that felt like professionalized Airbnbs. At the same time, most of Airbnb's inventory was also non-professionalized, and so you'd have, couples or people maybe renting out their extra home, but there wasn't that professional level of service. And so Patch actually kind of fell into this really great niche where Booking.com, Airbnb, and everyone really wanted Patches or not Patch, Sonder's inventory, on their platform, which kind of led to some pretty interesting dynamics when it came to negotiating take rates and things like this. So I can't give specific numbers, but they gave you a little bit more leverage when you're highly sought after supply, where there isn't that much of it.
Got it. Yeah, that's super interesting. I might jump into that here in a little bit with the group questions. I'm sure there might be some. So
Totally.
transitioning into Patch, like what was like the founding story for Patch?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I gave a little bit of my background, but when Aaron and I decided we wanted to start, first and foremost, we actually decided we wanted to start a company of our own. We had done a lot of 0 to 1 stuff at Sonder, actually. So we knew we worked well together. We had launched several unique teams, including like the supply growth and supply chain teams there. And so we knew we kind of had that chemistry, if you will. And we really wanted to see if we could replicate that outside of the well-financed ecosystem that was Sonder. It's really easy to do it when you work for a company that's raised like over 400 million in venture. It's a much different exercise to do it when it's just you and the buck stops with you. So that's kind of step one. Step two was really me really wanting to bring it back to climate. It's the whole reason I got a formal education, and the unfortunate reality is basically because they're not really on the right track. Every day that goes by becomes a more relevant problem to address. And so when you think about mitigating climate change, you have two major levers. You have the decarbonization lever. So that's how do you pollute less? So that's rolling out renewable energy, that's electrifying vehicle fleets, things like that. The second lever is how do you remove carbon? So that's actually taking carbon out of the carbon cycle and storing it in some sort of stable way. So one is, preventing, stopping the bleeding, if you will. So prevent actually the more pollution from being emitted. And the other one is actually command-Zing or undoing the damage that's already been done. And we actually had the perspective that although there's a huge amount of work to be done on the decarbonization front, between like the advances we were seeing in electric vehicles or the cost of renewable energy going through the floor, we felt like the decarbonization snowball, if you will, had kind of begun to accumulate a little bit. And although, we're still, 10, 20 years out from like, really meaningful decarbonization, we felt like the carbon removal part wasn't really even beginning to accumulate that momentum. And so we really wanted to focus on this piece of the equation. And when you dive into carbon markets, which is how you access carbon removal, it's this kind of this existing ecosystem where you can buy and sell different forms of carbon removal, which is, for those who don't know, carbon removal, again, is taking CO2 out of the carbon cycle and storing it in some sort of stable way. But there's no software managing this ecosystem. And so what ended up happening were all the problems you typically see in non-digitized markets before some sort of marketplace. So there's incredibly poor liquidity, poor supply transparency and price transparency. Commission structures were incredibly high, so there's a lot of value destruction. And activation was high. And so really all the cruft that comes with B2B procurement that really exists before Fair existed or Airbnb existed or any of these other marketplaces existed with carbon markets. So really we thought, well, we just need to apply the same marketplace principles we saw in the many, many, many incredible marketplaces, businesses that came before us to this existing market. So not actually a particularly novel concept. The thing that's a little bit different about Patch that's a little bit more rare is that we took this API first distribution technique. And the reason we did that goes back to the initial goal. And the goal is to remove gigaton scale of carbon removal. So I didn't get to mention that before, but most climate models have us needing to remove anywhere from 10 to 15 gigatons, so 10 to 15 trillion kilograms of CO2 per year for the next 2 to 3 decades. It's an immense amount of mass. And so, kind of putting that aside, that's going to come, that mass or that CO2 is going to come from hundreds of billions of transactions, which will require hundreds of billions of carbon calculations and capital allocations, or basically purchasing or transacting in carbon markets in order to get that CO2 out of the air. And so our thought process was, well, whenever hundreds of billions of anything happen per year, it's usually a computer doing it. So how do you build an interface a computer can understand, an API, rather than an interface a human can understand, like some sort of visual experience on Airbnb.com or any other marketplace that can augment the existing systems of record we've already built, whether it's a payment facilitator. We actually work with a bunch of marketplace businesses like for e-commerce, travel management systems, whatever it might be, to automate the process of climate action. And instead of having some sort of separate ecosystem you have to go to transact with this particular flow, it's built into the flows we already use day to day. And that's what we truly believe is necessary to get to ubiquity of climate action. So that's kind of why we took this approach.
Got it. Yeah, thanks for sharing more with us on that. Yeah, we're going to jump into some of the kind of nuances of it here in a little bit. I thought it might be helpful though, maybe if you could kind of give us maybe a high level kind of overview of it as a business first though.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So Patch at like really like in a very simplified case is a online marketplace to access different forms of carbon compensation. So that's both traditional carbon offsetting as well as carbon removal. So on the platform, there are many different ways to sequester carbon, from something as familiar as reforestation, so it's actually planting trees and storing carbon in the biomass of the tree, to something a little bit more human engineered, like direct air carbon capture, which is essentially these large fans that suck CO2 out of the air, run that CO2 through a solvent, which is essentially a chemical that captures the CO2, and pure air comes out the other side and the CO2 stays behind. There are all these different ways to sequester carbon, and each of those ways is run by a distinct business. So there are, you know, large organizations where their sole purpose is to sequester carbon with the intent of selling that service to someone. We work with those parties to load their capacity or their inventory or supply on the Patch platform, and then we actually make it transactable to purchasers. So we both have a visual interface where you can, kind of shop online. It looks very similar to what you might imagine, but instead of a consumer using it, it's a business using it. So that's worth calling out. We are a B2B marketplace rather than a B2C. Or there's the API use case where we're actually selling to tech-enabled businesses to launch carbon neutral crypto, or using something where maybe instead of 1% cash back, it gets piped into carbon removal. We actually just had a partnership announced the other day with Sender, which is a large credit card points infrastructure player, where they're going to actually unlock climate action as a reward, where their customers include like Citibank, Amex, et cetera. So there's a future where you'll be able to turn your points into some form of climate action using the Ascenda Patch integration. So really that's kind of the core use case, is how do you kind of unlock all this kind of automated climate action through a traditional marketplace model.
Got it. Yeah, thanks for sharing with us. Yeah, so touching on one of the kind of aspects of it as a marketplace, how are you finding the partners, and is there some kind of like vetting or kind of like auditing process for onboarding them?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great point. So, one of the big components of marketplaces are trust and safety, right? That's what a lot of marketplaces spend a lot of time on. Now, safety is, I think, less of a meaningful concern, right? Like, it's not like we're renting out a car or a home where someone's like personal life can be in danger. It's not to say like direct air carbon capture can't have like any sort of incident, but that's a lot less common. Trust, however, is paramount because this is a very abstract service that's being provided, right? We have this effectively this invisible gas in the atmosphere that someone is saying, I removed some of it. And so it's like, well, prove it. And so you need that trust layer. So the way we evaluate that is essentially there's what are called verification standards. And so what a verification standard is you can think of it as almost like certified organic, where there are specific steps and processes per sequestration type that you need to go through in order to actually be able to create a ton of CO2 that's transactable or sellable. Patch does not run that process. So that's something that's really important to call out is Patch cannot be at the same time a marketplace and a verification standard, because that's a huge conflict of interest. It's almost like where it'd be the credit rating agency and the stock exchange at the same time. We see already kind of the crazy stuff that can happen when those are separate parties between like a Moody's and a NASDAQ. Assuming they're the same, it would cause havoc. And so we think it's incredibly important that structurally, to prevent any sort of like conflict of interest, we never are doing the verification ourselves. That being said, we still require particular verification data to be provided to us and loaded into our system in order to start transacting. So although we are not producing the data, we are ensuring that the data is provided, and we actually have legal and financial recourse with each of our supply partners that if, for whatever reason, any of the information that is given to us becomes invalid because of gross negligence, or because in some, like the most severe cases, fraud, we actually have legal and financial recourse to make that right on the platform and either reallocate or refund the end buyer. So we kind of provide the legal and financial guardrails, even though we are not verifying the work ourselves. And really, again, that goes back to the idea of the kind of inherent conflict of interest that if we were the same party.
Yeah. So then on the demand side, like what type of businesses use Patch?
Yeah, so we definitely have the strongest product. So for what it's worth, we're only a 15-month-old company. So there's definitely like, we're probably like 80 or 90% product market fit. So like there's definitely some segments where we're like really crushing it, others where I'm like, I'm not really sure this is working or not. So things that are really working well, really any sort of financial technology. So both institutional banks, Sender, I would consider kind of in that bucket with like rewards providers, crypto companies. So we actually have companies like Palm, which is an NFT infrastructure company creating carbon neutral NFTs powered by Patch, as well as things like neobanks. So that's kind of one bucket. Second bucket is e-commerce and brands. So again, that's an incredibly easy kind of sales motion for us, both working with like infrastructure businesses to power some form of e-commerce, like a Sendoso, which actually ships goods to people. In the context of sales prospects, actually, and then actually like proper brands as well, like big folks like Lingerie who create sustainable swimwear. The areas that we're kind of just beginning to break into are logistics, which is kind of like basically it's like underneath the hood of e-commerce. So that's almost the same segment, but we don't consider it the same. And then finally, carbon accounting. And carbon accounting is actually a brand new suite of software or a new classification of what is traditionally SaaS, where it's essentially, you can think of it as a carbon ERP, where a company might buy a carbon accounting tool like Persephone, where they say, I don't know what my carbon footprint is and I want to become more sustainable. So this software will actually take all the data across your business and help you quantify the carbon impact of your company and provide reduction suggestions. So this is how you can pollute less or change how your business operates in order to mitigate your carbon footprint. But then the last step is the compensation piece. And so what they're actually doing is providing the ability to compensate an app using Patch's API. So they're almost white labeling Patch's tech and marketplace within their own product. And so that's kind of like a great example there. That's almost like the Plaid to Neobank example, where it's a must-have feature, but not necessarily a differentiating feature that makes sense to build in-house for carbon accounting tools. So those are the major verticals we have great fit in. Trying to work our way into travel. That's moved a little bit less quickly, partially because of COVID, partially because we haven't really prioritized it, but that's kind of the next big vertical for us.
Got it. Yeah. So it sounds quite broad. Do you see like the future is being more specialized within kind of categories and having, a more kind of tailored product experience, or, how do you think about that?
Yeah, totally. So the beautiful thing about APIs, this is what makes me more excited about infrastructure companies and versus marketplace companies. Where marketplaces, if you have a UI, you're typically forced to specialize or tailor a little bit. That's why there can be so many long tail marketplaces targeting towards specific niches of people. It's not the case with infrastructure. So right now we're taking a very general approach, like you said, so we can service a huge wide of use cases. I don't see a world where we need to change the product meaningfully in order to capture those verticals. That being said, I think that is actually more of an exercise for like developer relations and product marketing, where it's like, hey, if you are a tech company or a travel tech company, these are like the 3 or 4 quick start guides that might make sense for your business. Doesn't mean we have to change the product, but it might change how we market the product and position it.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm really interested in a kind of API first approach. I think you're actually one of the first founders to join us that has an API kind of first marketplace. So,
Cool.
Getting a little bit more specific into that, like, can you walk us through the steps to starting, Patch and then how it's maybe evolved?
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, there's this classic like Andrew Chen from he talks about this idea of the cold start problem, and it's a very common problem to have with marketplaces, and which side do you focus on first. So what we actually focused on at Patch was essentially because sales cycles are so long with infrastructure companies specifically. So you don't get like the immediate like B2C consumer activation where someone signs on and maybe can transact on the same day. You typically have to integrate with something, right? So there's code that needs to be written. And so as a result, you can actually, we actually did is we pre-sold a lot of what was on Patch. And so we're like, this is like what maybe our 3 to 6 month roadmap is. We actually don't have any of it, but we're going to pre-sell that kind of those capabilities to help people understand where we're heading, and if this is something they do or don't want. Based on that feedback, we're able to course correct a little bit. It's better to get feedback before you build something than after. It's a lot easier to get on the right track. And while we were doing that, we were onboarding supply. Where suppliers, it was actually a lot faster to onboard. So we would say, hey, we have Palm or Persephone or X, Y, and Z company onboarding on the Patch. They're going to be on like 2 or 3 months. So you need to make a decision in 2 or 3 months whether or not you want to get access to this demand or not. And that becomes very tangible and easy to have conversation because they're not like betting on you and be wondering, oh, is the demand going to come or not? And so we got in a lot of situations where people would, suppliers specifically, would get on the patch and start and kind of actually get their first couple of sales within the first month or two because, again, we kind of had this integration piece in place, and we could kind of. It was actually a pretty interesting like, orchestration experiment where it's like, okay, it's like this company 6 months out, they want that supplier who's 1 month out. Okay, like that matchup is going to make sense, and we kind of thread the needle a couple times there, where then eventually you kind of hit that critical mass, and now we're at the situation where the supply and demand on each side is balanced out, and we're not having to do that dance anymore.
So, maybe what are some unique challenges with the kind of API first approach that you maybe didn't, see in the very beginning?
Totally. So, I mean, definitely a unique challenge with API first marketplaces definitely is the lead time required to get someone live. So I think that was probably predictable. That being said, it still is a unique challenge you have to kind of balance. Now, because of that, because we're both B2B and API first, which they tend to be mostly that tends to be like they tend to coincide with each other. We're able to put a little bit more attention per customer getting onboarded, and so we're really able to make sure, like as they activate on the platform, they have a really good experience because we don't need 10 million users of Patch to be really successful. We actually probably only need 1,000 to 10,000 users. We look again more like an infrastructure business versus a market, like a true B2C marketplace. And as a result, you're going to have maybe 1,000 customers with an ACV between $100 to $1 million. And it's like, so you really actually only have 1,000 people you need to make, or 1,000 parties you need to make sure have a really, really remarkable experience. That being said, that results in typically a longer lead time. And so when you have 18 months of runway and the sales cycle is 6 months, that's pretty problematic. And so we've spent a lot of time compressing that sales cycle where it used to, like, from start to finish, take 4 or 5 months to get something done. Now we're actually at the 4 to 5 week mark, which is a lot more palatable. It's a lot easier to predict new people coming on the platform, and that really just comes from maturation of the product and the sales team.
Got it. And then, as far as that sales cycle, who are you selling to? And then is there technical implementation required from like a development team internally, or what is that like?
Yeah, totally. So primarily selling to tech-enabled businesses, going back to those verticals I mentioned before, if you don't have a software team, it usually doesn't make sense to work with Patch. That being said, we do have a visual product. So we have had like folks like EQT, which is a private equity fund out in Sweden, just manage their carbon portfolio on the Patch dashboard. And it's very like, you can leave a Patch dashboard very similar to the Stripe dashboard, where everything you can do in the API, you can do in the dashboard. So there's no necessity to use the API, but that's where like some of the real power comes from. Now, as far as technical implementation on our side, we've seen like a pretty wide range of people who want like a desired involvement. What I mean by that is we have like some small startups that say, just give me the API key, I'm gonna like whip up something, and they'll ship something in 2 weeks, and that's incredible. And then you'll have larger customers, actually want us to like get into their product requirement documents, support them on implementation, and kind of like spec out like, oh, this is how we really recommend you build this. And that's kind of more of us sharing best practices and kind of providing a little bit more white glove support, if you will. In that case, there's typically, again, looking like an infrastructure business, some sort of implementation fee or additional kind of support fee to warrant allocating that much labor to that particular person, versus the startup where they're like, hey, I'm gonna rip right through this. And we've had some people like build their feature with Patch in like a week, and we've been like, wow, this is remarkable. Okay, great. So it's a bit of both. It really depends on the size of the customer typically.
Yeah, that's really interesting to see. Yeah, maybe we'll have some marketplaces here in the community.
Well, and it's also interesting to see we're under NDA with all these folks, so I can't share the specifics, but like seeing like also how all these companies work with, because we're like in their product requirement documents, like helping them and suggesting things. And so it's just fascinating seeing all these different organizations and how they get work done. And like tech companies that we are all familiar with, if you heard their name, like, oh, that's how they actually get work done. It's fascinating.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. So jumping into kind of, like the business model, could you share a little bit more about, how you guys monetize?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, we monetize like a traditional marketplace. So we have a take rate. It's typically negotiated per customer, but it's on average 15%. And so, it's basically if you push, 100 grand through patch makes $15,000. So very, very standard kind of take rate model. And we also have a usage-based model. And so what I mean by that is there are a few things that you can do with the patch API that, although you're not transacting, puts an unnecessary amount or can put extra load on the system. And so we get into a little bit more of a, again, like SaaS infrastructure type use case or pricing scheme there. So it might be looking like number of estimates that you call. So we don't only have the ability to buy target removal, but you have the ability to footprint using patch. So if you're doing 1 million estimates a day, you're going to have a pretty meaningful platform fee to actually help us like basically pay for the cost of the servers and upkeep and maintenance to make sure our systems don't go down. Second piece is actually the ability to reserve but not buy inventory. So if you think about actually, it's funny, it's actually what's very similar to how electricity works, where you have to pay for both like the kilowatt hours that you consume. So how many electrons are you actually using to power your home or whatever? But actually in like B2B energy markets, you actually have to pay for capacity. So that's not just the amount you consume, but the rate at which you consume it. And so we actually have a very similar model where if you want to like reserve 1 million tons on the patch platform, which is actually like a meaningful percentage of tonnage on the platform, but not necessarily buy it all, you actually have to pay a larger monthly fee just for the right to reserve that inventory. Because by reserving it, you're basically sucking it up from someone else and transacting with it. So there's an opportunity cost there. And so we make sure we actually incentivize people to use truly just what they need from a reservation perspective by layering on this additional pricing mechanism.
Got it. Yeah. So, I mean, you're solving a huge problem. And, it's definitely a super interesting approach to, being API first and kind of infrastructure layer. So like, what are some of the, I would say like North Star metrics and kind of KPIs that you're focused on?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple. So, I mean, really like GMV and effective take rate is like, there's an obvious one for the group here. That shouldn't be too surprising. Really not focusing again, because it's pretty early days for us. We have like tens of businesses using patch, like 35 or 40. So not really focusing on like something like average customer value or anything like that. In addition to, we've only been in business for 15 months. So retention and kind of like cohort, like retention by cohort isn't actually really meaningful right now because we don't have like all those customers came in like the last like 4 months. And so like we don't really have like that much baseline to be totally candid with all of you. So we'll see how those metrics evolve kind of going into the that being said, something that's really exciting for us is customer count. So again, like even if you're not actualizing GMV, like the idea of booked GMV or the number of customers is actually very interesting for us. And this is actually use cases. So that's something that really gets me excited because basically any new use case you can unlock, we have about like, I think like 8 or 9 right now that are very like crisp use case, like fintech or travel tech, et cetera. Basically like unlocks a new vertical, which actually is just represents like TAM expansion. And like, sometimes I get a little bit annoyed when people do like really buzzwords on TAM or whatever else. But like at the end of the day, like if you unlock a new vertical or find product market fit in a new vertical, and it's a meaningful size, it can actually represent like a 10, 15, 20% expansion of the broader opportunity that you can unlock. And so that's actually a huge lever for us, which we've focused on quite a bit. And which has actually helped us unlock whole new customer sets where we'll say, hey, we're going to run like a 3-month experiment. We're going to sell into this vertical really, really hard and see if we can get some nibbles. If we get like 3 or 4 use cases out of that or case studies, then we can say, hey, now we can shop that to all the other people that are incredibly skeptical and see if they change the tune, which we actually have seen. That's actually what happened with crypto, where back in March, we had no crypto customers, no crypto estimation capabilities or anything. And then we basically took a bet saying, hey, we think crypto could be a huge market for us. And then we quickly built something and shopped it around. Now I think almost 1/3 of our customers are crypto companies. So again, it's kind of like this, how do you expand the broader opportunity? So number of use cases is something we actually pay attention to a lot. But that obviously doesn't change like week over week, right? That's more of like a quarter by quarter, who are we going to go after? So it's not a super volatile or reactive metric, but definitely one that we want to keep in mind.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about crypto and if that was a, kind of a vertical you were taking on. So
yeah, that's one that's really exciting for us.
Yeah. Awesome. So, on that note too, how big does Patch get, in the next like 5 to 10 years and what's needed to get there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if you do like a top-down analysis on that 10 gigatons per year, right? So that's 10 billion tons really quick. And so, The average kind of ton of CO2 sold today is around $5 per ton, but that tends not to be very permanent. And so we actually expect that to climb all the way up to like $50 to $100 over the next 10 years. So you basically have 10 billion times $100. So that's basically $1 trillion of spend on carbon removal if we're going to hit our climate goals, right? So if you think like the Earth's going to melt down and like we're all fucked, then like you don't think past is going to be a successful business, and that's fine. But if you do think we're going to hit our climate goals, or we're at least going to attempt to hit them, so you're going to need anywhere between like a couple $100 billion to $1 trillion of spend per year on permanent carbon removal in order to hit that goal. And then it's like all about like what percent of that do you capture? If you capture 5% of that and then have a 10% take rate, you're basically looking at tens of billions of dollars, or single billions of dollars of revenue and tens of billions of GMV on the platform, which is like one of the biggest marketplaces of all time. So it's obviously a huge, huge outcome. But that's what I would kind of describe as like the theoretical upper bound for Patch as a marketplace business specifically. Now, we've seen a lot of marketplaces do this, where as you grow GMV, you typically supply becomes a rate limiter when you become really big. And so then it's like, how do you layer on all these value-added services to maybe on the board exclusive supply or catalyze the growth of an ecosystem? And so I expect Patch to actually be doing a lot of that work, not in 5 or 10 years, but rather like 2 to 3, actually. And then that's kind of a totally different monetization model where Patch is going to actually like more and more just like a fintech for carbon markets over time versus a true marketplace.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Might have to do a follow-up then in 2 years, because I was going to ask how you saw the kind of market changing.
It's so we do about 1% of the carbon removal we need to do to hit our climate goals. So we basically need this ecosystem to become 100 times bigger in 10 to 15 years, which is a really rapid expansion. And there's going to be a huge amount of information and operational complexity associated with that. And that's software's opportunity.
Yeah, so something I wanted to talk about, is the fundraising journey, and if you could share a little bit more about that, because I know you have some pretty incredible investors like Version 1 Ventures and Andreessen Horowitz. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm pretty candid about the fundraising stuff. So I'll give it to you all straight. The first round, the pre-seed round, we raised from V1 as well as Pale Blue Dot, which is a climate-focused fund out in Sweden, was like an absolute slog. So it was like the second or third month of COVID. I quit my job with no backup plan, basically. I think Sonder probably would have taken me back. I think they liked me enough. But again, it's good to kind of let's remove all the distractions. And really, I basically had to beg the entire executive team, all my friends who just new venture capitalists, because I knew this needed to be a venture scale business. That had become pretty obvious pretty early on, just because of the necessary R&D investment up front. For any investor intro, I don't care if they're an analyst or a partner, please just put me in touch with anyone. And I basically ended up, I think, speaking to around 40 or 45 firms, and got basically 2 yeses out of that. Right. So it's literally 38 consecutive no's and then 2 yeses right at the end. One of them was Angela, one of them was Hampus, from Pale Blue Dot. And it's you only need 1 yes. And so that was enough to get us live. To be fair, we literally had 8 slides. That was what we were raising off of. We didn't really have anything else. So I don't necessarily blame the other funds for not betting on us by any means. And then, so that was great. We were able to kind of get our feet underneath us and start building and get some early traction. And then the kind of conversation with Andreessen was definitely a little bit easier. So I was actually an inbound through Darcy Coolican, who works at A16C, actually knew Angela quite well because they're both from the Canadian tech ecosystem. And so they actually knew each other. And they actually came about around September or October 2020, asked to have a conversation. We had that conversation. And then, things kind of moved on from there. And then we ended up doing something in December with the seed round. And then the kind of other piece associated with that was Cotu, who led our Series A just the other day. They were the other firm bidding for the seed round. And then they basically weren't able to quite get there at the very end. And so they ended up kind of dropping out of the process at the 11th hour. Again, no problem at all. And then basically I just stayed in touch with them over I guess it was the following 6 months, just sending them investor updates with some sensitive information removed. And basically just got to the point where they're like, oh, okay, no, this is actually going super well. Like we want to do DA now. And then the rest is history. So we didn't really do a true proper fundraise for the A, and we did like a half process at the seed, and we did a very robust process for the pre-seed.
Yeah, so some familiar names that are also in the community with some of your investors. So that's great to hear.
It was definitely a drag though, like the pre-seed, like especially the first couple months of COVID, like that was like quite depressing, honestly. And like I have a huge amount of like renewed empathy. Like I was like, oh, like being a founder is tough, but like basically being said no to like 3 times in a row in like a day, and you have to like hype yourself up for each conversation so you're not like sad on the call, is quite an exercise in emotional labor, and like really just like keeping the morale high, keeping the serotonin high, hyping yourself up, and then not getting too down on yourself. So much easier said than done, I would say.
Yeah, we can all certainly relate here. So we're all having to motivate each other quite frequently here in the community. So, well, cool. So I feel like you and I could go on talking for quite some time. So we're going to jump into questions here in a little bit. But before we do, I wanted to see, you have some pretty great experience at Sonder, and then, obviously now with Patch, and, you're in the trenches with their recent raise.
Yeah.
So do you have any kind of like tips that you like to share with us for early stage marketplace founders that might be helpful?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, I think the biggest one is really, like number one is kind of like tenacity. Sorry, I'm moving. I'm realizing I'm almost out of battery, so I gotta charge up here. Is really just like endurance. So if you're building like a venture back business, like honestly, it's probably not you. It's probably not even the VC. They just don't understand the particular vertical. It's just like sometimes it's not a fit, and it is what it is. And you, again, much easier said than done, but you really got to like make sure you don't let one conversation kind of get you down. Now, that being said, you should still listen to the feedback critically, but I think, finding a way to emotionally decouple, what is critical feedback versus like, I don't know. I literally had one or two VCs like cut me off like 2 minutes into the conversation and be like, oh, I got this, like, this is not going to work. Like, there's no shot. Now, I think there's probably more tactful ways to give that type of feedback. That being said, it's also like considered a bullet dodge, if you will. If you actually had worked with that person, it probably wouldn't have been very fun. Things got tough. That's kind of piece number one. Piece number two with marketplaces is truly understanding which part of the equation, if you will, or which side of the equation, whether it's supply or demand, is truly a rate limiter, and at what phase of the business is it going to be a rate limiter. So if you truly think, and like my personal perspective is, if you truly think demand is going to be a rate limiter in the long run, I would assert that that's going to like put a pretty hard cap on the size and like the rate at which your business can grow. And the reason for that is if supply is a rate limiter, like that's the case with Patch, you can always incent people to build more supply or develop supply. We did this with Sonder where we would have like long-term offtake agreements with folks to build more multifamily housing, or with Sonder or with Patch, we can have like long-term agreements where we get booked revenue for new supply, and they can actually develop it and then unlock that capital. So there's all these different ways where if you bring demand, like supply will come, if you will. The opposite is not always true. Sometimes it is to start up, where it's, we're going to we know people are buying from these suppliers, we aggregate and standardize. This is actually a really attractive proposition. But if demand is truly the rate limiter, it's going to be really, really tough to build a truly, truly massive business. Now, that might not be the goal. And so that's also again, understand what your goals are and what you want to do. For Patch specifically, we want to build something really, really big. And so making sure demand isn't the rate limiter is incredibly important.
That's really helpful. So I'm actually gonna have a question on the supply here in a little bit.
Cool.
But, we're gonna let some of the founders that are on jump on. So hey, Davey, do you wanna come on?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot for sharing all of that. It's super interesting. Actually a kind of a bit tricky question that I would like to ask you. I would love to hear your thought about that. So I know some NGO, because that's what I was planning to do basically, is try to diminish my carbon impact. And I know some NGO, they provide this service.
Yeah.
The NGO had this kind of legitimacy, knowing that's a non-governmental organization. It's like, why a funder should come to your place that you've decided to monetize this and create like a full marketplace on it. So what would be the difference? What would make me choose to come to your place instead of going to regular NGO? I'm sorry, it's not a nice question, but I would just love
No,
to,
it's a great,
to
no,
hear
it's
your thought
great. It's a
about
great
that.
point. Yeah. So first and foremost, in the case of NGO specifically, again, depends on the NGO you're talking about, but in a lot of cases, there's sometimes two problems with NGOs. The first is they can't do everything, right? So, and in many cases, NGOs are, in many cases, developing the project or partnering with folks on the ground in a particular country or nation or community to help develop that land in a particular way. And so in many cases, we would actually consider NGO as a potential supplier on Patch, actually, rather than an alternative on Patch. So the idea is if you truly want a really broad diversity of types of solutions, it's really hard to do that if you're a developer because, again, there's that operational component. But that's my experience with Sonder versus if you're a true software layer to interact with many different operating partners. So that's kind of piece number one. What we've seen is anyone even allocating over $50,000 towards some sort of climate initiative, people are allocating across 3 to 10 different projects. It's very hard to do that where you have to engage 3 to 10 different NGOs. It's much easier to sign one agreement with Patch and kind of fan out from there. The second piece is the software component. So if you truly want to just say, I want to buy $50,000 worth of tree planting impact in a particular place, it actually might make sense to go directly to the NGO. What I would kind of respond with is, if you want to actually build some sort of embedded product where you're surfacing the climate impact or initiative to users, whoever those might be, if you want to not actually have an operations team running this relationship, but rather write just a few lines of code and put this type of product on the autopilot or initiative on autopilot, it's a lot easier to do with something like Patch because, again, we outsource all that overhead and BD away, and you really just have to write a couple lines of code or click 1 or 2 buttons in a UI. So for me, it's really all about activation energy, total cost of the program, and diversity of supply.
Thanks a lot. And I have another question is like, now that you've raised funds, what are the biggest challenge? What are the next big challenge that you want to overcome with that? And what do you fear a specific challenge that you have in your industry right now and is going to take a lot of resources for you to overcome and go through?
Yeah, absolutely. So truthfully, I actually think the biggest existential threat to Patch is us not being able to hire enough truly talented people fast enough. Like that's like the biggest threat to Patch. So like we've got great fit on both the supply and the buy side. We have kind of the financial backing. You don't raise money to hold on to it. You raise money to give it to people to do things. And so like that kind of last step is actually, I think, the biggest risk to Patch because we actually have a huge number of fairly large customers coming online. So if we can't like hire engineers fast enough or BD people to bring on more supply, we're going to be in the situation where like the system goes down or maybe we're out of stock or something. And we've like done all this work on fundraising and capturing demand, but we're unable to service it. And so that's actually the biggest threat to Patch as business right now.
Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, those are great questions. Hey, Tomas, do you want to jump on?
Yep, sure thing. Thanks, Mike. Also, Brennan, super stoked about what you're doing. That's awesome. Definitely very needed problem. And yeah, I mean, just really thinking realistically about the scale of logistical challenges that are going to be required to hit our climate goals, like in practice. To your point, definitely creates like the perfect opportunity for software to step in. So really excited about what you're doing. One of the questions I had is, to the point that you made earlier, the way that you guys interact with the kind of like, certification organizations, like the analog being, the organic certifiers, is interacting with them as a third party. I have heard that there are, each different like certifier, has their challenges, has their kind of, strengths and weaknesses. Can you talk a little bit more about like your process of choosing which certifier to work with and also which to not?
Yeah, absolutely. So there aren't that many certifiers first and foremost. And so right now what we're seeing is there are kind of 4 major ones across like Gold Standard, Verra, Climate Action Reserve, and American Carbon Registry. Those are the 4 large ones. And then there's actually independent bodies that are not truly a verifier, but they are maybe an evaluator, like Carbon Plan or Carbon Direct. And these are like independent organizations that are evaluating carbon projects. So right now what we do is, unless you kind of fall in those buckets, we actually don't work with you right now. What we're kind of exploring today is actually trying to figure out like what the right role is to play there, because there's an argument to be made where the market right now is incredibly essentially difficult to understand truly what's going on. And so like the first kind of phase of patches, we're actually focusing on aggregating a huge amount of inventory and showing like next to each other, like even like in like comparing products on like apple.com or something like that, like what are truly like the differences between each option, because right now that doesn't even exist. Of like, how do we actually pick who makes sense? And so right now we're actually going through the process of standardizing the information and trying to be a little bit less biased about picking who the winners and losers are, but rather saying, hey, we're going to standardize and ensure all this information is accurate and let the buyers pick. And so typically what we're doing is saying, hey, these are the 10 standards. This is what's good and bad about each one. And then as an organization like Palm or whomever, they'll say, okay, I think I want to do this one based on the information you presented to us. So we're really trying for the product not to have any bias built into it. Now, there are situations though where someone might say, you show me this information and I still don't know like what's going on. And so then it's at that point, Patch then kind of layers on there, puts on their consulting hat and says, okay, Brennan, if I were to build a climate program, would do X, Y, and Z reason for these kind of to hit these particular metrics. And I won't go into the deep nitty gritty of that because it gets a little bit technical, but that's historically, or at least right now, the approach we're taking. Now, marketplaces typically, or at least what I've seen it, you typically like add everything, standardize everything, and then you try like deduping and removing fakes, and then like adding product segmentation down the line. So like what patches like Airbnb for work or Airbnb Lux is going to be, I'm not sure yet, but I imagine a world where people are going to push us much harder, where we can't just simply be a standardizer and aggregator, but rather we have to express a little bit more opinion from a product segmentation perspective. That typically comes a little bit later in a marketplace's life cycle, but we might have to do it a little bit sooner.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. That's a great approach. Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Awesome. That was a great question, Tomas. I was actually going to ask about standardization myself, so that was great. Hey, so I had a question for you, though, Brennan, and that is, how important is it to, build the brand for Patch and, maybe recognizable to, businesses and maybe consumers, being an infrastructure, is it like, how do you think about that? And people know maybe that like it's powered by Patch, for instance.
Absolutely. So businesses, it's paramount, right? Like Stripe, Plaid, all these organizations have although those are infrastructure companies, they have an immense amount of employer and like B2B brand awareness, and kind of you're like the de facto way to interact with a particular type of ecosystem. And so that's an incredibly important piece. So making sure companies know who we are is critical. And we're just kind of beginning to build the marketing function out right now at Patch to help enable that. Consumers, I am not going to front like I have the exact answer, because I don't. I've gone back and forth on this, where we've played with the idea of like, oh, maybe do we want to be known as much? It's probably going to be somewhere between as consumer facing as like Affirm or Plaid is. Where Plaid, you kind of like sign into Wealthfront or something, and you like see like the Plaid logo, and you're like, I kind of recognize that, but I don't actually know what that is. If you're like a true consumer, not in tech, versus Affirm where like that's like squarely planted in checkout. But again, I guess Affirm has a consumer app now. So, but before Affirm had there's no world where Patch has a consumer app, for example. But there was a world where Affirm or these buy now pay later providers were truly just at checkout, and you're like, oh yes, Affirm. I've used Affirm before. I'm going to continue to use it. So somewhere between that and like that, almost like Inception, like, oh yeah, I recognize that logo, but I don't know why I recognize it. Of Plaid, somewhere between there is probably going to be where we land. I don't see a world where we have a consumer product or anything like that, though.
Got it. Yeah, those are great examples, and some of those were exactly what I was thinking of. So
yeah. Or even with actually Shopify does as well too, right? When you go to a Shopify store and you go to a Shopify checkout, and you're like, oh yes, this is formatted like a site that I know, but there's no Shopify branding anywhere. It's like the shape of it is the same, and so probably somewhere in that world, most likely.
Got it. Yeah, and I know you know Shopify well, so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I don't know how well I know as of late. I haven't been there in 7 years, but I try keeping current.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious to learn more, what is your team like today? And, what are maybe some kind of hires, in the near future?
Yeah, totally. So we're 15 people growing to 45 off this Series A. So we're tripling in size. That's pretty wild. Right now it's really about half go to market, half product, engineering, and design. But for the most part, going to keep that. But this kind of this emerging third of kind of go to market on the supply side that'll continue to mature. So on average, it'll be like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Or like there'll be 2/3 dedicated to each side of the marketplace, and then 1/3 product engineering and tech to kind of make sure those two speak to each other through software on average. Now looking to about double the size of the actual sales team. So about 4, we're going to go to 8 to 10-ish, actually primarily in Europe. So that's kind of something else that we're doing a little bit different than maybe most marketplaces. We're actually internationalizing much earlier than traditional marketplaces. That's really because there's a huge opportunity for us in Europe. What may or may not be intuitive to a lot of folks on the call is Europe is very climate forward. And so we want to make sure we can help those folks over there hit their goals. So, kind of going through the exercise of translating all the content, both user generated as well as kind of static, in addition to being multi-currency and multi kind of payment method. That's kind of piece number 1. Piece number 2 is actually growing out the marketing organization. So we're actually in the process of hiring a VP of marketing, and they're going to actually grow out a 4 or 5 person team, primarily focused on PR, product marketing, and demand generation. So kind of that'll be a whole net new function. And then continuing to double down on engineering. So we're in SF. I'll do a plug. We are hiring for all these roles. Patch.io/careers. If you want to come through, we'd love to talk to you. It's funny, we actually have a bunch of people who used to be founders who work at Patch now. So it's great for the culture. It's like really high ownership, high autonomy. And then, kind of the last piece is really trying to build out the engineering team. So we're a 3-person engineering team right now. We're going to grow to 10 or 12. And going to be bringing in a director of engineering as well to help kind of run that piece of the organization.
Awesome. We'll definitely have to share some of the jobs here in the community. So
yes, I have to do my intro. I haven't done my intro yet, so I'm sorry. I will do it though in circle.
You're totally good. You're totally good, man. So we're almost out of time here, but I did. You mentioned the kind of launch into Europe, so I wanted to ask, if we could take a little bit more time to kind of touch on it. But what
totally.
does like launching a new market look like? Because you're not like a localized marketplace. I'd be really curious to learn more about that.
Yeah, totally. So we've been onboarding supply all over the world already. So we kind of have the European footprint from a supply perspective kind of primed up. So launching a new market for us, well, the approach we're taking is so we've gotten a little bit of feedback from some of our European customers that maybe the way Americans do business doesn't necessarily jive with them. Totally fine. And so the approach we're taking is we're actually hiring country leads, where we're going to actually have a go-to-market lead based in Germany, one based in France, one based in Sweden, someone who kind of has enough Patch culture in them, but truly understands the nuance and the culture of a specific geography to understand what an appropriate way to sell into an organization in that country actually looks like. So they can speak the native language, they understand the kind of social norms there better than Aaron or I or anyone else in the go-to-market team does, as well as what we're typically focusing on is, do they have a local network of folks they can or a book of business they can sell into as well. And so we're kind of like buying network, buying social norms, and kind of having them kind of almost own the market, if you will. So that's how we're doing it.
Yeah, that's really exciting. So well, cool. Well, this is a super interesting chat. So once again, I appreciate taking the time to join us and share more about all your awesome experience. Before we wrap it up, though, time for a quick plug. Where can we keep up with you at?
Yeah, where you can keep up with us at Patch.io. We're also on Twitter at usepatch. Look, we're hiring 30 roles across Europe and North America, remote friendly, have an office in SF. If you like the office thing, we're all vaccinated. Come hang out and save the planet.
That's awesome. Well, thanks again for taking the time to join us, and thanks for the great questions, everyone.